At one point, I was part of a rather odd cult. My parents joined it because my grandma convinced my dad it was the right thing to do. I was born after about a year of them being in the cult. This cult was different from most in the way that rules could change in a matter of days, just by the prophet or one of the higher members, mostly consisting of his many wives, getting a revelation from God. It supported polygamy and believed in MMP, multiple mortal probation, meaning that before this life you were someone else. The prophet himself claimed to have been Joseph Smith in his last life, and before that, he was Moses. As such, many other members claimed to be other important religious historical figures. My parents weren't into it as much as some of the other members, so I never had to deal with polygamy in my family. There were many stupid revelations that the prophet received from God. Some of the biggest of these being that God forbid the use of meat and dairy, so we must all go vegan to please the Lord. About a year into this vegan thing, the prophet had another life-shattering revelation. This time, God said that we were all going to be delivered and that we must disconnect from the outside world to do so. This meant everyone quitting their jobs and cutting all ties with family and friends outside of the church. For some reason, my parents still thought this was normal, and being 12, I couldn't do much about it. So my dad quit his job and we started living off of savings and credit cards. This lasted for almost a year. Both me and my youngest sister had started showing allergic reactions to wheat because that was all we could eat. This ended up giving me a gluten sensitivity that lasted about 2 years. The final straw for my parents was when my mom was combing my youngest sister's hair and an unhealthy amount of hair just fell out. That day, my dad bought dairy products and my parents asked to be moved to the lower division of the church. They say they mainly tried to do this for us because they didn't want us to lose our friends. But the church prophet was infuriated by my parents' request to move and simply kicked them out and damned them to hell. Shortly after this, my dad moved up north to find work. About 2 months later, he told my mom the marriage wasn't working out and he divorced her. I didn't talk to my dad for over a year. During this time, my mother chose to move to the opposite side of the state from my dad to prove that she could make it on her own. The church gave me many problems that I still have to cope with today, such as my social awkwardness or complete lack of how the public system works. But I'm glad I was able to get out when I did.
My parents decided to attend a Christian church that was very much a cult when I was 3 and my brother was 5. As far as I can recall, my dad only attended a few times. When I was to start kindergarten, they also enrolled us both in the private Christian school that was associated with the church. We were taught through the ACE program, which was just a small part of this whole cult. The first red flag was that it was 100% mandatory for attendees of the school to also attend the church. As you got older, they also monitored your church attendance. If you got in the red, not enough attendance, then certain extracurricular things were taken away. For example, performing in choir or basketball games. As kids, we were spanked over the knee by a male principal with no parents present. Church members had sexually abused younger kids, and it just got swept away under the carpet. We were taught from young that anyone who didn't attend our church were sinners, and we needed to help save them. I remember being 5 years old, sitting on the playground by my childhood home, trying to convince my best friend why she was a bad person and needed Jesus. It was very, very frowned upon to have friends outside the church or school, and as I grew up, my oddness pushed all possible friends away. Now, this school had rules. No talking about movies, books, music, comics, etc. if they were secular, aka not made by a Christian. We were always in uniform, and boys and girls sat at different tables in the lunchroom. In class, there was no talking aloud, unless it was to the teacher, and you worked according to the Accelerated Christian Education program. There was also no talking aloud in the changing room for gym class until grade 6, for fear that we were talking about bad things when the adults weren't around. When your friends and relatives decided to leave the organization, the pastor would get up on a Wednesday night, listed as a members-only night, and address that the family had gone against God and left. He would also slander them and make up lies about how ungodly they were, and that if we let our children associate with them, then they would be influenced by Satan. The pastor had this thing he would do when a family member brought it up in a meeting, the fact that they wanted to go to another church. He would tell them, "Okay, you go pray to God in your homes, and I'll do the same. We will come back tomorrow and discuss it." The next day, the pastor would come back and say, especially to the wealthy families, "God has told me that this is still your home and you belong here." Of course, the family will let him know that God has told them it's time to go. The pastor would immediately say, "Well, I'm a pastor and I hear from God. You are tainted by other factors influencing this decision. If you go against my direction today, you are going against God." There was this mandatory Bible camp that was attended by any teenager 12 to 18. It took place in the school church, and it was religious teachings for 6 days straight. We were not permitted contact with our parents, and admission to the school was not allowed if you didn't attend. I was 12 years old with pneumonia and a severely infected wisdom tooth, and I was not allowed to stay home. I was also not allowed to have my medicine on me, as I was a minor and had to literally chase down any adult who was clueless on my condition to let me in the room. When they found out you had Facebook, they dragged you into an office without parents and told you to log into Facebook so they could check it, to ensure you weren't up to no good. If you refused, you were suspended, your parents were instructed to paddle you, and some were even directed to kick you out. Parents listened because they feared that their other children would be tainted by this bad apple. Many families were torn apart. You weren't taught about sex at all. We weren't allowed to be alone with guys, and no dating until 18. When you were deemed old enough, you had to ask the pastor's permission to date the person, and immediately attend counseling sessions to help you grow towards God together. You needed the church's permission to marry, and most were informed that they were getting married less than a year into dating. When you started grade 9, you had to sign a contract that you would attend Bible college after graduating high school. If you didn't sign it, your life was made hell. You were pulled into meetings, counseling sessions, and suspended. And if you didn't follow through, the same thing, but instead of suspensions, your parents were told to outcast you. There's so much more, but it's been 7 years since I left, and I'm still broken and torn over all we went through. My mother was so naive, and she let us be manipulated and abused because she knew of nothing else. A lot of truths about the financial lies and lies of other members were brought to light. We left because of the way they manipulated us, our family, my brother, a whole different story, and we left because my parents finally got how fucked up the place was. I only survived because I learned to live a double life. When I was 9, I told my friends that the walls have ears, nothing you say is safe. I sheltered the sacred parts of me and only let them out in the dark from age 9 on. But even then, I was brainwashed so badly. I grew up believing that everyone outside of this organization was bad, and I needed to be saved from them. We weren't allowed to wear makeup or even paint our nails until grade 9. And all outfits worn, even to church or other non-school events, had to fit into the guidelines given. You were to act godly 100% of the day. If you even tried to stand up for yourself, you were hauled into the principal's office. I remember when I was assigned my counselor. She was a 26-year-old new mom who had just married her husband. She would assign me Bible verses to read, and I had to come up with insightful things to say about how it changed my life. I found out a few sessions in that my best friend told her something in confidence. We were told the room was a cone of silence, but it got told to 3 female elders and the pastor's wife. The next day, she didn't show up for school and was suspended for a week. I realized that day that these sessions were only there to monitor us and make us feel valued, in order to have a line in on our lives. I wanted to make sure that I never let it slip what my life was like outside of the organization, for fear of the repercussions.
I was raised in a conservative, evangelical church. Dad left the family when I was 6, and I'm an only child. I was always very close to and protective of my mother. I'm male, and I always knew I liked boys. I grew up constantly deeply ashamed of myself. I was 16 when I finished high school, and in the summer holidays before I intended to start university, I took a 3-week camp run by a youth with a mission called a Summer of Service. There was a lecture in the first week of the camp, where we were taught in the importance of confession. I was already entirely familiar with doctrine, that if you have unconfessed sin in your heart, then God can't hear your prayers. But the speaker convicted me about it more strongly than I'd ever felt before. A couple of weeks prior, I had received a 33 kilobyte dial-up modem for my birthday. It was 1996. And I saw gay porn for the first time, so I was feeling extraordinarily guilty at the time. The camp told us that confessing to God in personal prayer was adequate to receive forgiveness, but that if the sin was heavier than we knew how to cope with, we were welcome to confess to any of the camp leaders in 100% confidence of privacy. So I told my group leader about the porn, and that I liked boys and not girls. He told another group leader, and they told the camp leader, who fed this up the chain to the base leader, who told her husband, and the next morning, I was sat down for a meeting with all 5 of them. They told me it was their moral-bound duty to help me heal from my homosexuality, and the best way to accomplish this was for me to join Youth with a Mission full-time. I was reticent to even consider giving up my plans to study computer science at university. I was told that a secular university would corrupt me, and I would end up openly gay in a rebellion to Christ. I genuinely wanted to be straight, and to be right with God, so I wanted the help they were offering. Ultimately, the kicker was that if I didn't agree to a DTS, or Discipleship Training School, and join Youth with a Mission, then the base leader would be compelled to tell my mom about my same-sex attraction. I couldn't bear how that would hurt her, and so I gave in and joined. And that's when they started the first 11 exorcisms performed on me over the next 4 years of my ex-gay therapy. I was sent to Russia for my discipleship training school. It was a fairly hellish place to be as a 17-year-old in 1997. I had friends tortured by the Guy, which is a kind of police. I had friends taken hostage by Muslim extremists. We thought they were dead, but eventually, they did get released. I had to be smuggled out of the country in the end. Long story. Not enough time or space to go into it here. After my discipleship training school, I was sent to what's called School of Intercession, Worship, and Spiritual Warfare in Israel, and then I helped run more of those same schools back in Australia. I spent 4 years with Youth with a Mission and ex-gay therapy. As far as my family and friends at home were concerned, I was working as a missionary. I kinda was doing that along the way. Around the end of 2000, I was so crushed by my utter lack of any progress, or healing, and facing the realization that the only way to maintain my faith was to live my entire life celibate and single. I did not believe I was capable of that, and I felt betrayed by God. I was suicidal. I made plans for how to end my life a few times, but I couldn't follow through. Finally, one day I told my base leaders I was having doubts, and we started arguing. It went badly, and within the hour, my bags were packed for me, and I was escorted off the base and told to go away. 4 years, and it was over. Just like that. I went home for a few months, but when I started to come out of the closet, my mom kicked me out of home and had me excommunicated from the church, where most of my friends and family went. So, early 2001, I ran away to Sydney and started living my life my way, and for myself for the first time ever. It was incredibly terrifying and liberating at the same time. I still feel damaged by what I went through, but I'm happy with myself now, and I am glad at least for what I learned about life through it all.
I accidentally joined the World Mission Society Church of God, which is a Korean cult that believes in a man named An Sang Hong as the second coming of Christ. And the current leader is a woman who he selected as his spiritual wife. Typical lavish affections and gifts at the beginning of the process, and slowly they start to infiltrate your life. Once I realized it was a cult, they left out a lot of details in the beginning and started slowly letting on. I started to distance myself. It was very hard because a few of them had really become close friends to me. Certain members followed me to my school buildings and waited for me outside of my classes. Two of the girls called me crying, begging to go to heaven with them. It was tough to say goodbye. They really believed what they were preaching. Then I moved to the States and only receive an occasional email from them. They still remind me of my life number, just in case I ever want to go back to a church in my region and need to fill out any forms. A life number is what you receive the first day that you are baptized into their cult. Ironically, the organization received an award for philanthropy from President Obama a few years ago. Genuinely kind people, always helping the poor, needy, doing volunteer drives, etc. Huge presence in poorer countries in South America. They also have expanded pretty extensively into Southeast Asia and China. But I ain't about that cult life. On the bright side, it turns out that if An Sang Hong really is the second coming of Christ, I still remember their prayers and shit, so I'll be all good, I guess.
Exchange students sometimes have it worse. I was an exchange student from Malaysia when I was placed in Missouri in 2006. They were a family of 4, son and daughter, and they lived somewhere around Webster Groves. They looked nice, warm and welcoming, but it was all a facade, for they were trying to gain my trust. Coming from a country where all your neighbors are practicing a million different religions would kind of desensitize you or make you very aware. I was the latter. The first week was fine, but sometimes I would wake up a little early and find them gathering in the kitchen in a circle, around the kitchen table, mumbling and whispering. They'd stop as soon as I entered. It was very disconcerting, but I brushed it off thinking it was an American quirk. During the second and third week, it became worse. The boy wouldn't touch me because I'm born from sin, his words, and the girl was afraid of me because I spoke to the father whilst looking him in the eye. I started prodding her for answers whenever little things I did, which are normal by the way, like reading before bed, talking directly to the parents, or eating a sandwich, would elicit small gasps and hyperventilation. She told me that I have residues of the wicked, and that I'm going to hell. She told me about a cleanse and a daily prayer wash. I've seen them singing the same hymns over and over again, reciting the same verses in different tones, and it really freaked me out. I wasn't stupid. I realized I was in a cult when they took me to church. I was made to sit in the front, and the pastor was conducting the service specifically for me. I realized it when I looked around and saw that everyone was looking at me. I felt like I was in a horror movie. Wide-eyed, silent stares. Men and women were separated. People wore different colored ribbons on their wrists, and the children looked haunted or just plain frightened. Nobody spoke to me or even came close to me. The men never looked at me in the eye, and the women whispered and shunned me. I went there twice. School was on break, so I had to stay in with them. Many weird things happened, but none was as bad as waking up in the middle of the night to find the mother sitting next to my bed, reciting verses from the Bible in the dark. As soon as I'm awake, she'd stop and silently walk away. The family began treating me badly after that. I was punished for being out of line, which no dinner, locked in until morning, no sweet drinks. I had to cover up with long sleeve tops, long pants, skirts, etc. I think I lasted because I was curious. They probably thought that since I'm from Southeast Asia, I must be quite gullible and naive. They tried brainwashing me about how sinful I was, how lost I was, how the world is going to end and I'll be dragged into hell unless I accept their teachings. I was there for a month before our chapter coordinator came by for a visit. I told her everything, outside the house naturally, and I left with her immediately. We came back with a group of people from the exchange organizations about an hour later and found them in the midst of burning the things of the sinful non-believer. Thankfully, my passport and other relevant docs were untouched. I never found out what kind of cult they were.
Wow, where do I begin? Born into a cult and left at 32, just 1 year, 3 months, and 20 days ago. I was part of a cult called the End Timers in Florida. We were led by a man named Charles Meade, who we all believed to be a prophet and an apostle of God. My parents joined the cult in their late teens and had 4 children in the cult. Meade led through fear, as many and the most do. Growing up, I remember things we were banned from, just to name a few. Blue jeans. They were a spirit of the world. Sunglasses. Hid the light of the body. Tint on your car. Trying to hide something. Facial hair. Sex spirit. Hat backwards. Rebellious. Chewing gum. You couldn't hear God. My parents made good money, but lived in near poverty because of the requirement to drive multiple Cadillacs and to give monster donations to build Meade's dream sanctuary, a $14 million barn. Medical help was turning to man, and all marriages were arranged by Meade. If you kicked against the pricks on who you were told to marry, you would be ostracized. Homeschooling was only allowed, and education was poor at best. I was told who to marry at 16. I quit school in 11th grade and married her at 17, father at 19, and so life went. We believed we had the only true message and acted as such. No friends outside the cult, which made it especially painful to leave at 32. Not only did I lose my job, but lost all my friends, and ultimately, I had to leave the city. It all started to change when Meade, good riddance, died in I think 2010, and his grandson, James Burback, took over the church. The rules began to be removed, and he desperately tried to put a church's face, Mountaintop Ministries, on the cult. Programs, outreaches, logos, websites, etc. But in the end, the thing that tripped up his grandfather got him too: money. He began to live a life of such opulence at just 28 years old. $1 million home, $500,000 gym, Range Rover, Jaguar, Cadillac, Mercedes, etc. Respect for him began to wane among the older folks, but nobody would challenge his calling. In October 2015, it was revealed to the cult that Meade was actually a pedophile and had been molesting a particular member of his family for years. Burback held it together until late December when he was overthrown. The cult still lives and is run by self-proclaimed prophet John Linton.
I was in a cult. I was at a homeless shelter, having dinner, and this guy struck up a conversation with me. He told me about this program that would feed me, house me, and get me clean and sober for free. It was the dead of winter, and I was in a very bad spot. I was willing to try anything to get clean and get my life sorted out. I told him to give me a night to think it over. I thought it over in a tent in the woods. The next day, I called him from the courtesy phone in the hospital, and he drove me out to this property in the marshland just off the highway, in a town I'd never heard of before. My intake was on January 11th, 2012. I didn't realize it was a cult until I'd been there a day. By then, the guy who drove me in was gone, but they fed me, and I got a warm bed and a friendly welcome. This could be an entire novel, but I'll pare it down to the main points that I think OP is wanting to hear. Some of the rules: no women, no nicotine, caffeine. They UAD'd for both. No white bread, yeah. No reading material that was not assigned. No phone calls, no outgoing mail. No leaving the fence property unless supervised by a cadre or escorted by a Phase 3 or higher member. I heard that someone got kicked out because they were on a bus and their escort saw them talk to someone they recognized. Easily the strangest thing was webcast. I don't even know why they called it that. I learned not to ask a lot of questions because that could land you in the hot seat. More on that later. Webcast was essentially a big room full of wall. When webcast was announced over the PA, everyone filed into the hall and the lights went down. Then a video would play, but it was mostly giant words flashing up on the screen for a moment and then being replaced by more words. This was accompanied by a loud male voice doing a weird narration. The first one I ever saw said approximately, "You're in a cage. There is being outside the cage." The word cage flashed onto the screen. There are two men in the cage with you. The being opens the cage and you're free. You run into the darkness. You remember the two men in the cage. You have to turn your back and save them. Save them. You run back into the cage. But on and on like this. It was like a parody of a brainwashing scene from a Warner Brothers cartoon. I remember realizing that I'd gotten myself into something. I wasn't scared. Not of the other guys at least. There were about 60 of us. The cadre would always joke that we were living with 60 of our best friends. What scared me was the idea that the ridiculous attempts at brainwashing would over time actually have some sort of effect on me. You couldn't leave the property unsupervised for 9 months of blackout. Then you could transition into being a phase. A phase could escort men to town and back and were allowed to listen to the radio, and sometimes one of the cadre would take you to a concert or a movie, but usually he would take you on hikes where he would blow this stupid horn intermittently, and no one could talk. Anyway, I was able to keep it together and not become like the others. They weren't super crazy, just anchored very deeply in their beliefs, a far-off cousin of Christianity. Punishment was not extreme, but it was actually very unpleasant. When you intake, you are assigned a color. Green is new, blue is higher, then silver, then purple, and then you became a phase. If you fucked up, you were yellow and got kicked out, but orange was the worst. If you were orange, no one was allowed to talk to you at all, and you had to spend an hour in the hot seat. The hot seat was a chair in the middle of a small room. The cadre would bring in all the men that they knew you were friends with, not the ones that you weren't, and they would sit in the circle around the room and take turns telling you what they didn't like about you, and they had to have something. It would go around and round until time was up. Then you were free to go. I never sat in the hot seat, but I sat in on 2 hot seats. Both men cried. Grown men. I'll spare the bulk of the story, but I was in this program for a year. I never saw the guy who brought me there again. I was in this transition for 3 months, and had just become a phase when I got kicked out. The exit was pretty straightforward. You were escorted out to one of the vans, and just to note, you couldn't get your things from your room, and driven into town, where they would just drop you off and leave. No one was allowed to talk to you, or they would be exited too. Then you were on your own, to get out of bumfuck nowhere. Writing this, I'm still surprised that I entered and exited a cult. But I'm still clean and sober, and I have a much better life now. So I guess it was worth it, and I even got a couple of stories to tell.
I grew up involved with the Quiverful movement, a type of Christian fundamentalism that involved having a bunch of children, home education, extremely modest dress, including head coverings, the practice of courting, and betrothals. Basically, semi-arranged marriages taking place as soon as the girl was old enough to marry, and something called Christian patriarchy, wherein the father is viewed as a sort of mini-god. I grew up attending a small Christian school run by the local independent fundamentalist Baptist church, where every student was Quiverful. We were required to wear extremely modest clothing, ankle-length skirts, hemlines that covered the base of our necks, etc. We had wardrobe checks multiple times each day. Each morning we pledged allegiance to the Christian flag and to the Bible. It's been years, but I can still recite both pledges by heart. Then we recited the chapters of the Bible we were working on. Yes, I did say chapters. We memorized several books of the Bible, Jonah, all of Paul's epistles, most of Genesis, Daniel, a decent amount of Leviticus, and I think the Gospel of Mark. Our schoolwork was primarily books published by Abeka, BJU Press, and ACE. Our textbooks claimed that no transitional fossils had ever been found. The Loch Ness Monster had been proven to be real and was a plesiosaur. The Great Depression never happened but was just a myth made up by the socialists. Slavery was a win-win situation for all involved. Dinosaurs breathed fire. The KKK were great dudes who had a bad rap. The Trail of Tears was actually super great. Outer space wasn't real because if you blew on a pile of baby powder, a new planet wouldn't form. This was demonstrated. The liberals don't believe in personal responsibility. The world is about to be attacked by the floating space Jerusalem. The government's plan to Holocaust the Christians was seen as much more important. For 1 year, the girls took Christian Charm. This was primarily about how God really cares about whether your chest is 10 inches larger than your waist or not. Girls were forbidden from standing with their feet parallel, like a man's, instead having to keep our feet at ridiculous and painful angles. We couldn't walk without being careful to glide gracefully and avoid swishing our knees. We were forbidden to not smile, but our smiles were never big enough, or they were too big. There wasn't much time for real schoolwork anyway, since we were all so busy being punished for having an ungodly facial expression, and forced to spend the rest of the school day standing on our tiptoes on one foot in the corner. In 4th grade, my parents chose to pull me out and homeschool me. We joined a local homeschool group filled with Quiverful homeschoolers. My parents had gone to a different church, one which was very charismatic. We spoke tongues, exorcised people, healed with prayer, but not necessarily quite so extreme as the IFB school I had been sent to. However, as my parents became more violent, he had a lot of mental issues and was an extreme hoarder. My mother, who was borderline hoarder and very depressed, so much so that for the first 10 years of my life she barely left her bed except to use the washroom, became more and more heavily sucked into this subculture. My parents had already gotten rid of most of the TV channels over concerns about evil spirits and only allowed us to read a few classic books. But after this, my mom first stopped allowing us to read anything non-Christian, then banned novels altogether. We began being forbidden to see anyone who did not go to our church or homeschool group. Since my parents never really started teaching and I had little access to books and at the time no internet, this left little to do all day aside from copy out Bible verses and stare out the window for hours. Time sort of stopped meaning anything. We became more into the biblical patriarchy thing, where my father was seen as the head of our household and a sort of direct representative from God, who women were to serve and obey in every way. We weren't supposed to express any kind of wishes or desire, but leave it up to your husband/father to make all the decisions for you. If you were his daughter, this included selecting your husband. Girls were expected to be stay-at-home daughters serving their fathers until marriage. Biblical femininity was emphasized, which in this case basically meant long skirts and not having options or desires, except to serve whatever man God chose as the best helpmeet possible. For a couple of years, my mom, who was herself a nurse, stopped allowing us to take medicine, believing it to be witchcraft. She became more and more crazed about the idea of demons trying to attack her and our family. Unfortunately, I was born with a birthmark on my leg. She believed that this made me Satan. My father and mother both searched for ways to fix this. I've been exorcised, had oil poured over me, had everything I owned burned, etc. It apparently didn't work. After my father died, we were at least spared this extreme violence, but my mother became only more unhinged and depressed. She shifted from being quiverful to being charismatic. We'd been both for a while, but my dad's death pushed us all the way from one to the other. She mostly gave up on her idea of me as Satan, but became absolutely obsessed with the idea of Satan attacking our family. This belief is reinforced by our church and all the charismatic material she reads. She even abandoned our homeschool group, believing it to not be concerned enough about how demons are possessing everyone. Our church is obsessed with spiritual attacks, which are seen as stemming from absolutely everything. Anne of Green Gables? Witchcraft. Christian music? Actually sung by Satanists filled with subliminal satanic messages. Cabbage Patch dolls? Demons who stay still when we look at them. I'm 100% serious. The only way to ward this off is speaking in tongues, making prophecies, etc. A few people in my church believe they hear the voices of demons in their head, and said demons are chasing them. I've been there as we've all laid hands on people and prayed for them to be liberated from the demonic oppression in their lives. I still live with my mother and sister. I still go months without seeing anyone who isn't from my church. I still have no real education. I posted this in another Ask Reddit thread and was almost rescued. Unfortunately, the person who had been trying to help me had to delete everything. I'm very grateful to her and to everyone who tried to help me. I haven't given up yet, though. I will get out, I just don't know how yet.